It is a dark and stormy, rainy evening, so I thought what better time to talk about my favorite kind of horror. And I mean horror in both books and movies and TV shows. And for the longest time, I've honestly denied the fact that I even enjoyed horror in any of those mediums. But as I've gotten older, and especially over the last 2 years, I can't really deny anymore that certain types of horror I actually really do enjoy. It's usually 3 specific types. Aside from, like a few one-offs like Halloween and the original Wes Craven's The Hills Have Eyes and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, things like that, I find those movies to be very good. But generally speaking, when it comes to horror, I usually only like horror in about 3 different genres. And that would be gothic horror. So that's things like anything by Tim Burton or Bram Stoker's Dracula, things like that. And cosmic horror, so that'd be anything written by H.P. Lovecraft, the movie The Thing, a couple other random movies here and there. Prometheus, I believe, has elements of cosmic horror in it. But what I really want to talk about, which is my favorite kind of horror, I don't have a name for it. There really isn't a name for it. I've tried to look up what it might be called, and there isn't a name for it on the internet. I was first introduced to this kind of horror in 4th grade when, as a class, we read the story The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, and it was read as a play. It was written as a play, and we read it out loud that way in class. And I didn't think anything of it until the end of the unit. Our teacher showed us an episode of a TV show that the play was taken from. And that show was The Twilight Zone.
Next up, Twilight Zone!
Now, I became kind of obsessed with The Twilight Zone about a year ago, and I've seen many episodes of it, but I've been digging for something similar, because there's something about The Twilight Zone that's so creepy and so weird, but so different from any other kind of horror that's really out there, and there really isn't a name for it, although The Twilight Zone typically gets just kind of lumped into a sci-fi thing because it does have a lot to do with aliens and things like that. But overall, in my opinion, the most viscerally scary and frightening episodes of The Twilight Zone don't have anything to do with aliens or monsters or anything like that. It's all within the people and what's happening with them and psychologically in their minds and these things that happen to them. And there's another show I found called One Step Beyond. Now, One Step Beyond was a different kind of show from The Twilight Zone in that it didn't really deal with sci-fi elements, because every story was real, but it was more so that they were urban legends or, slightly true stories, or some of them were really true stories. There's certain things that make these movies extremely frightening and scary, and I could never put my finger on it. And there's another movie as well that fits into this category extremely well, and it is an old movie from the 60s called Carnival of Souls.
They demand that she dance with them at the Carnival of Souls.
And it's probably one of my favorite horror movies. But Carnival of Souls, The Twilight Zone, One Step Beyond, the things that make these movies and shows scary are what I would consider my favorite kind of horror. And I haven't been able to put a name to it. But I'll tell you what makes it scary. And it has something to do with something called liminal space. Roughly, generally speaking, is kind of just a familiar place or a familiar thing, and there's something off about it. There's something odd about it. And it's typically a transition. It kind of translates into the word threshold. So there's a transition between this place and some other place. And so we see this very obviously within the Twilight Zone and within the intro of the show.
There is a 5th dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
And with One Step Beyond, you're taking one step beyond reality. You're crossing that threshold. You're at that liminal space. And this is particularly interesting when you go look at Carnival of Souls. Liminal space is creepy because it kind of enacts a sort of primal fear of the unknown within our minds, of what's out there, or this is something that's familiar but something's wrong. This could be from like an empty hallway, there's no one there, an empty church building, an abandoned car, something familiar, but it's in the wrong place. And this is something that the Twilight Zone, Carnival of Souls, and One Step Beyond execute very well. And Carnival of Souls executes it well in a number of different ways. It has a different format than those anthology shows because it's a movie. And so you've got several different things happening with the liminal space in the movie. Basically, if you haven't seen the movie, I'm just going to issue a spoiler alert right away. The movie it jumps immediately into this car race between these three girls and these two guys. And the guys ended up pushing the girl's car off of a bridge. And they say the girls are all lost and dead until at one point, one of the girls comes to the surface and she's alive. And she plays the organ at a church, and she's going off to another place to kind of start a new life and start her organ playing there. And while she's on her way there, she spots this kind of eerie looking large building way off in the distance. And around the same time she spots this, the figure of a man appears in her window. And what we have going on here is we come to find out later that the building she saw is this old abandoned carnival. So what you have there is an extremely liminal space where something that was once thriving and alive with people is completely abandoned and everyone's forgotten about it. And so there's some creepiness to that. And then at the same time, you have a guy standing outside her window while she's driving. Now that's creepy on its own without the whole liminal space thing. But what we have there is a man standing outside her window while the car is moving. He shouldn't be standing outside the window because the car is moving. So there's kind of a idea of something in the wrong place there that makes that an extremely terrifying shot. Another part of it that's scary is that you know that it's a man, it's a human being, but something's wrong about his face. His face is white and droopy looking, and he's got this blackness around his eyes, which we know is we recognize as makeup, but it's a frightening image because it's a human being, but it doesn't look right, and he's not in the right place. And as the movie goes on, you get several other elements of this kind of liminal space where this man keeps appearing outside her window, inside her room. Sometimes randomly, people don't hear her, people don't see her, people don't acknowledge her. And this man has been chasing her this whole time, and no one seems to see him or believe her. By the end of the movie, you find out that she is actually dead. The last shot of the movie, they pull the car up out of the river, and there's 3 bodies in it, and one of them is the girl who you've been following the whole time. It plays out like a very large episode of The Twilight Zone, particularly the episode The Hitchhiker, which is probably the most frightening episode of The Twilight Zone, in my opinion. And it does nothing in the way... That episode of The Twilight Zone does nothing in the way of frightening imagery, but you see one guy, a normal, unassuming looking guy, and just a shot of his face sends chills down your spine, and you know that's a good use of liminal space in this kind of horror. But back to the Carnival of Souls, the liminal space is used in that this woman is out of place. She shouldn't be where she is. She's a soul that's been lost. And at the end of the movie, in one of the scenes, she goes to the carnival, the old carnival place, and all of these dead people are dancing and in a very awkward, fast-paced motion. And there's a kind of a uncanny valley kind of a thing with it, where it's familiar but something's wrong about it. The way they're moving isn't right, the way they look isn't right, and they're in a place that should be empty but it's not. So it's kind of this liminal space thing flipped on its head again, and in another liminal and creepy way. Basically, at the end of the movie, the carnival chases her down, and then her soul is taken with them, and she's now part of the Carnival of Souls. And it's a fantastic movie. And this is a kind of horror that isn't really explored a whole lot in a modern day setting. What the Twilight Zone gets kind of recognized for is how it kind of implements social commentary. But what One Step Beyond does is it doesn't really have that social commentary as much as it has terrifying stories. So the first episode of One Step Beyond follows a newly married couple on their way to their honeymoon suite, when all of a sudden the bride starts giving the husband directions. You drive here, turn left here, and her voice is different. And then she runs out to this place, and it's called Eagles Point. And suddenly she doesn't recognize her husband, and she runs away from him and takes the car and drives away. And you come to find out, spoiler alert, you come to find out that she is been possessed by the spirit of a woman who killed herself at Eagles Point just a few days before the events of this episode, supposedly. Again, with this liminal space thing, there's this idea of something being misplaced. The woman is familiar looking to the husband and familiar looking to the audience, but it's a different character that we haven't met yet. All we hear is a different voice, and we see different actions, and we see this hysteria build up around this woman. And it's a frightening thing to sit and watch, and there's no scary makeup, and there's no scary looking anything in it. It is just normal looking people acting, and it's this idea of this kind of something is wrong, something has been misplaced, and that, for some reason, is scarier to me than anything else that you can put on screen. This brings me now to kind of what I really want to talk about. As an inspiring author myself, an inspiring horror author, I strive to capture this same kind of horror in my short stories that I write. And each of these short stories has to do with this kind of liminal space. I have a story called A Lighthouse. And in this story, a man wakes up on the lighthouse and he doesn't know who he is. He wakes up on an island. And he doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know what his name is. He doesn't know how he got here. He doesn't know why he's here. He doesn't know where he is. He gets up and looks, and he sees this massive cliff, and on top of this massive cliff is a massive lighthouse. So already we have someone who's misplaced. He doesn't know why he's where he is, and he sees this massive lighthouse seemingly, and he's just in the middle of the ocean, and he doesn't know where anything is or what's going on, and he begins to explore. And this is a story I haven't necessarily finished a final draft of yet, but anyway, he meets a lighthouse keeper on the island who ends up being a spirit. And at the end of the story, basically what is implied through everything that the story details out is that this man was a lost spirit, and he's in an area of in between heaven and hell. And so is this lighthouse keeper. But because of the actions of this man, this lighthouse keeper was able to move on into the next stage of the afterlife and get out of this kind of limbo, this liminal space. And but the other man is stuck there. What doesn't matter is the way he looks. What doesn't matter is what his name is. What doesn't matter is why he's there. actually. What matters is why he's there. What doesn't matter is how he got there. All that matters is why he's there. He was there. His whole purpose was to move that other soul on into the afterlife. There's kind of this idea of we're alive and we're here for our reason. It doesn't necessarily have to do with the horror element of the story, but the story has horror elements to it, especially with this liminal space idea. All of these stories kind of involve this liminal space idea. I've written another story about a town that is sort of doomed to die from the very beginning, but that kind of unfolds as you learn how corrupt the town is, and of this lake and this dam that is eventually going to burst and the town will flood. But the liminal space kind of aspect comes into this as a main character of the story is returning to his hometown, and all of a sudden he's seeing how terrible it has become. So it's this familiar place where he grew up, but it's different. He's not seeing it with these like rose-colored glasses he had on as a kid. He's seeing it for what it really is, this terrible, terrible, evil place. And there's elements of horror into that. And even these things that are familiar to him, like a tree outside his window, collapses and his father's dying. All these comforts he had are gone. And I've written several other stories like that, but I don't really know what you call this kind of horror. So I've entitled this video a Nameless Horror. Maybe that was a bit clickbaity, but maybe there's a name for it that I just don't know. So if by the grace of God someone sees this video, if by further grace of God someone who sees this video has a name for that kind of horror, please tell me what it is. But for now, I'm calling it a nameless horror, and that is what really and truly frightens me.